American University. I'm Professor Tom Merrill of the Department of Government. I want to start by thanking all of you for coming. It's a great turnout, and I see that all copies of the Jacobin magazine have been snapped up. If you missed it, then you might want to ask one of your friends who might have one near you. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I want to mention that we have a lecture in the Political Theory Institute lecture series on Thursday. Professor Leslie Teal of the University of Florida is going to be delivering a lecture entitled The Future of Nature, Rights and Wrongs in the Anthropocene. I think I pronounced that right. If you're interested in that, please look at our website, which is on the SBA website. Please come. I think it was a mistake on my part to schedule this for Super Tuesday, since all of you might have your I suppose that it does allow us to a way into the question, which is to say, just to say this, that we live in an unsettled time. I think no one would have predicted a year ago or 2 years ago that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders would be two of the major final candidates. Whether or not they end up becoming the nominees or not, you'll have to check your phone during the night to find out. But it just seems to me, I don't have any great insight into this, but it does seem to me that the discontents seem to be systemic, that we seem to be at a point in which there's a lot of worry and a lot of anxiety and a lot of doubt about certain fundamentals of the system. And this may well be bad for the Republic, in the sense that you may well have some, how can I say this without saying any names, crazy person as president. But on the other hand...
Be nice about Hillary Clinton.
Touche, touche. On the other hand, unsettled times are also very, very good for political theory, because they show us that there are real questions at stake, and we have to take a step back and set aside the things that AU students often worry about, which is getting a job and getting an internship and trying to have some vocational way in life. Take a step back and say, what do we ourselves really think about things? So the fact that we're in this very unsettled time is all the more reason for political theory. We at PTI think that that means we're trying to have an empirically grounded but also normatively aware conversation of matters of great public import, such as our topic tonight. And I guess I would just say, for this is really, for me as a teacher, it's from a pedagogical point of view, for the students, now is the time in your life when you should really be arguing about big questions, right? It shouldn't just be about whether I can get a job downtown or what I'm going to do afterwards, but you should be arguing about matters of justice and injustice and what's the best social system, things like that. So you can't really do that unless you can't really own your own ideas, and you can't really have that conversation unless you understand what the other guy has to say. That's the basic premise of all of our Janus forums. And we hope that, I'm sure they'll say lots of smart things tonight, but we hope that we're trying to embody something of that attitude or that stance in the world of intellectual generosity towards people with whom we disagree. And so we invite our speakers with that in mind, because we think that there are people who are going to embody that spirit and make us think about things in a way that we hadn't expected. So let me introduce our speakers tonight. First up will be Bhaskar Sunkara, who is the founding editor of Jacobin magazine. He told us earlier today that he started Jacobin between his sophomore and junior years in college. Is that right? So all of you folks out there, get to work. And he's been called one of the breakout stars of the New Young Left, which I think is different than the breakdancing stars of the New Young Left, by the New York Times. McArdle is a columnist for Bloomberg News, and she's also been a blogger for many, many other publications, including The Atlantic, the one where I first started following Megan's work. And I should also mention both of them have books that you should go out and buy in the interest of supporting political theory. Bhaskar, your book is called The Future We Want. It's an edited volume of things from Jacobin. And Megan's book is called The Upside of Down. I forget the subtitle. But
Why failing well is the key to success.
Why failing well is the key to success.
A lovely gift. If you have any table legs you need propping up, it's a very good size for that.
That's right. It's even better in hardback. It's my experience. So thanks a lot for coming, and thanks a lot to our speakers, and we look forward to having a lively discussion.
So, I guess the question is, can capitalism be fixed? And I have only one page for you, so we'll see how it goes. And it's a page with very big handwriting. I write like somewhere in between the elementary school, like learning how to form letters with shaving cream, and the point where they, teach you how to write cursive. I'm still somewhere in that stage. But as much as I could tackle this topic, can capitalism be fixed? I guess I would say that my answer is a big no, but. And I say that because capitalism can be made much better. In fact, it's our moral imperative to do so. We see so many people around the world and in this country suffering from all sorts of suffering and hardship, facing needless want and insecurity in conditions of great abundance. And I think we should find that morally abhorrent. And I think it would be unconscionable to say that because capitalism, at least in my view, is ultimately a social system that should be done away with in favor of a more radically democratic social system, that in the meantime there's nothing we can do. And the people suffering day-to-day hardships and dreaming of better things will just have to kind of wait until some fantasy of a revolution to come. And in the meantime, if you can't rally a majority of people around common sense fix to make the current system better, how could you rally a similar majority of people for something even more radical? I don't think you could have one without the other. And I think in particular, what you've seen with the Bernie Sanders campaign, which unfortunately as the results come in might have had a tough day today, but I still think what you've seen over the past few months has been millions of people embracing a message that does say there are things we can do to improve our society. So many of these people were looking at the problems in their lives, and they were seeing their problems, especially since the 2008 economic crisis, as personal failings. Maybe they lost their job, maybe they lost a home, maybe they were just more stressed and had to work another job. Maybe as a result, their relationship with their spouse or other loved ones were under more pressure. They were feeling all these things, and they were considering perhaps that this was because they didn't take up this new skill, because they didn't get another certification, because they didn't learn how to adapt and compete in the new economy, and all these other sorts of feelings. I think at the very least, what you've seen by the widespread embrace of Sanders' message by millions of people is the idea that people want to believe, and they see that now that a lot of the problems they're facing are in fact not individual, personal problems, but they're social problems. And they're also recognizing, through the message of Sanders and other people on the left who are pushing forward solutions to problems, that the problems that they're facing have collective solutions. And it's things like universal health care, things like universal child care, things like guaranteeing maternity leave, and other things are capable of at least relieving some of the stress and pressure out of their lives. But moreover, the real radical thing in Sanders' rhetoric is that there are a group of people who are to blame for how things are going. And it's not just that we need to sit down and we need to look at some graphs and charts. We need to acknowledge that something like a European-style healthcare system or something like a parental leave would in fact benefit most people. It's not a question of confusion, it's a question of a group of people, a class of people, Sanders calls them the billionaire class, who actually benefit from the status quo and benefit from workers being, for example, insecure and unable in a condition of relatively high unemployment to be able to just tell their boss to, for lack of a better word, F off and find another job. That's very difficult in this economy, and there's people, the employer class benefits from such a situation, and the list goes on. And I think one of the most inspiring part of when I did some canvassing in New Hampshire and I listened to Bernie Sanders talk was actually that realization where even when I, as someone I think well to the left of Sanders, talks to most people about these issues, I'm not talking about worker ownership of the means of production with them. I'm often talking about these things, the way in which certain smart government programs can improve their lives, the reason why it's important to advocate for them, the reason why we should defend and extend programs like Medicare. I often don't leave out that part. I leave out the part that, the reason why we don't have these things, why we can't have nice things, is because there is a group of people with a vested interest in that. Sanders, to his credit, has not only talked in the abstract about the billionaire class. I myself would include many millionaires in my list of class enemies, but it's okay to just start with the billionaires. He also brings up the fact that he names names. He's talking about, in particular, the way corporations like Walmart and the Walton family benefit from the fact that they have a lot of their employees who aren't earning a living wage on the welfare rolls, because, not for any fault of their own, because they're working and they're still unable to make ends meet. And in fact, he was actually naming first names. And even I wouldn't name the first name of some of those guys. Like, I was going to say Luke. Luke Walton is not responsible for anything. He's a great basketball player. But no, he played for the Lakers, and now he's an assistant coach. But anyway, talk to me about Luke Walton afterwards. Actually, I want him to be the next Knicks coach. So hopefully this message gets out to him. So there is obviously this feeling now that things can be improved, but we know that we have to organize and we have to struggle if we want to push things in the direction of that would be in the interest of the vast majority of people. But the reason why I say, can capitalism be fixed? My answer is no, because I think can capitalism be fixed is different from can capitalism be improved. So even as we struggle to improve capitalism, I think we should acknowledge the way in which the dream of the great bourgeois revolutions of the 18th and 17th century, the dream of the French Revolution, of liberty, equality, and fraternity, of a world that has access to these things for all people, is forever frustrated by things at the core of capitalism. The dreams made possible by the material abundance of capitalism forestalls what we could do politically with this abundance. And ultimately, even though we've been trained to believe that democracy and capitalism goes hand in hand, if you actually look at the history of this country and every other country where there has been significant advances and we do enjoy some real measure of democracy, it's been democracy that's been fought by regular people and foisted over the heads and the interests of capital. So, to me, fundamentally, I say no, not because of any iron law of history, not because of any dialectical process. I come from a no bullshit school of Marxism that doesn't even use words like dialectical, unless I really am using it as filler, and I have no idea, that's a cue that I have no idea what I'm talking about. It's dialectical, I think that this is actually rooted, for me, in a moral and ethical vision, a normative set of ideas. The idea being that exploitation and domination are wrong, and insofar as it could be avoided and minimized and eliminated, it should be. And people given the option would choose, at a very base level, I do believe in human nature, people, if given the option, would choose not to be exploited or dominated. I think it's in our nature. I also think that, even Marx, even though he doesn't talk about a human nature, would agree with that. If all history, like the Communist Manifesto says, if all history is a history of class struggle, that must tell you something about the people taking part in history. They must choose to resist, if they can, conditions of being exploited and dominated. And then the question of where politics comes in is whether they're going to use this freedom from exploitation and domination to go dominate and exploit some other people. But that's a question we could get to. The socialist vision is fundamentally one in which democracy is acknowledged as the ultimate good and is extended from just the political sphere, and of course, in a lot of places, it's not even in the political sphere. It's extended from the political sphere into the social and economic spheres as well. It's a world where certain necessities are guaranteed to the very least as social rights just by virtue of being born. So today, even the most extreme Republicans, even your ardent supporters of people like Ted Cruz. I'm not mentioning Trump just because it's hard to place exactly what he thinks on anything. He's more just a feeling than a set of ideas. We'll believe that, let's say, if you're a young person, if you're 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, you have the right to the very least a basic level of literacy, a basic primary education. And they might shove these schools and shove these kids in charters and make them do a bunch of testing to test their achievement every couple months. But they'll believe maybe that they have the right for that free of charge just by virtue of being born. Socialists ask questions like, if you have the right to that basic level of education, why don't you have a right to a basic roof over your house, or 3 meals, a roof over your head, or if you have a house, it should have a roof as well. 3 meals.
Somewhere it never rains. Don't be sure what happens.
Right. We believe that those things should be enjoyed as social rights as well. And obviously, fundamentally, this is starting with a normative vision of trying to reduce as much as possible exploitation and hierarchy. And maybe the fact that we might need or want markets and competition in certain spheres. For example, in my vision of a socialist society, there would be lots of competition between worker-owned cooperatives. I was explaining earlier today to a seminar that I actually thought that it's very possible that firm failure rates might actually increase in my vision of socialism. But the risk for this competition would be far less. Because the risk for winning and losing in the type of capitalist economy that we have today is often poverty or destitution, and for those of us that are lucky, we can at least lean on our friends and family and other networks for a time, but for a lot of people there isn't even that option. Those are the actual stakes of this economy, and we can live in a society where even if we do have some measure of competition, even if we do need, let's say, management is democratically accountable to workers and are elected by workers, we could live in a different sort of society. And fundamentally, to me, I reject the idea that this is a society where we'd be making a fundamental trade-off. And I think socialists have often fallen into the trap of playing into this paradigm where we're trading off our freedom in exchange for equality. I remember one of my earliest engagement with the socialist tradition was actually because my parents came to this country without much money or resources from Trinidad and Tobago in 1988. I was born the next year, and in my house, one of the great heroes of my house was Fidel Castro. Now, Fidel Castro and Bill Clinton, for whatever, any charming populist. And the basic line was, when I first became a political consciousness, my line on Cuba was critical as it is now. What about freedom of press? What about freedom of speech? What about all these things? My mom said, would you rather be born in Haiti or Cuba? Would you rather have, freedom to eat or freedom to, write in a newspaper? I think those kind of trade-offs are what put the socialist tradition and the communist tradition and these other traditions in such a place of scorn for people in many parts of the world for a very good reason. I don't think we should buy that trade-off. Fundamentally, for me, socialism is about the problem of freedom and how to extend it to as many people as possible. And even something as drab as the welfare state, you could imagine in these terms. So if you're over 65 and you have access to Medicare and you have access to Social Security, that gives you a realm of freedom, a little glimpse of being able to leave the labor market, maybe, if you're able to, and it's increasingly hard given how small Social Security payments are, but you'll be able to leave the labor market and maybe rest after many years of hard work, or maybe to be able to not have to worry about having to deal with navigating through bills and debt for medical expenses that you incur later in life. Things like that, to me, I interpret as a realm freedom, a sense of freedom that social programs and socialists, the broader socialist ideal can actually give people. In the same way, if you're in a society with a jobs guarantee and near full employment, you have the sense to say if you're in a bad situation at work, you could tell your boss that you want to find new employment, you could leave, you could actually enjoy the feeling that you actually have some power over what you're doing. And if you believe that democracy is a good thing today when people are voting in places like Virginia, but you don't believe that democracy is a good thing 9 to 5, then I think there's a central contradiction there. And I'll end by saying that my vision of socialism isn't anything close to a utopia. I actually like the way that one of Jacobin's contributing editors, Corey Robin, puts it, which is, socialism is about converting the excruciating misery that people face on a day-to-day basis in this country and everywhere else around the world, and turning it into ordinary unhappiness. I want people to be able to have socially dealt with their animal problems so they can start to deal with their human problems. And that still means anxiousness and heartbreak and depression and all the other things that come with being human. But it means not having to worry about the basic necessities of life that a society with such abundance we have today should be able to give people. So I fundamentally return to this moral and ethical vision of a world with at least less exploitation, less hierarchy, more freedom, and more equality for people. And I think that at a certain level, I find no other form of politics, any other form of vision worthy of the name politics. And I do really think that's a horizon towards which we should be encouraging people to organize and build towards.
I should just open by saying, I think you're being too negative on Bernie. He's doing like 90% in Vermont.
Right.
And those mighty, mighty 4 delegates.
Oklahoma?
Yeah, you never know. As I recall from my own days as a fairly left-wing student, being the right-of-center person invited to these things is sort of like being the Christian invited to meet the Lions at a gladiatorial match. But so I guess I will just try to make you as angry as possible, and we'll see how it goes. So I want to actually start off by trying to convince you that you personally are richer than the King of England. Not the current King of England. But take the King Edward III in the 1300s, had a beloved 14-year-old daughter, arranged for her to be married. This is not actually as creepy as it sounds. They usually didn't consummate the marriage until they were a little older, but they married them off fairly young from matters of state. So he arranged for a trip for her to go to Castile, where her new husband was, sent her off. Unfortunately, communications in those days were not very good, and so he sent her off into the Black Death. She reached Bordeaux. They didn't realize that the plague was there. By the time they did, it was too late to flee, and she died in Bordeaux. His favorite daughter, the little girl that he had dandled on his knee. She died at the age of 14 from something that we can cure now with antibiotics and with sanitation. But that's just one of the examples. You are in many ways richer than John Rockefeller, the richest man on the planet at the end of the 19th century. Think of all the things that you have that they just didn't have. Not all of his money could buy him an iPhone. And that sounds, oh, it's just an iPhone, who cares? Not all of his money could buy him a phone call to someone he loved when he was traveling. It was not possible. If he went to the other side of the Atlantic, he was there. There was no way to speak to someone. Mark Twain, famously, his very rich at the time, for a while, the richest writer in America, his daughter died. He sent his wife a wire. She was in Europe. And for 2 weeks, his wife was on a ship coming home and did not know that her daughter, who she had come home to nurse, had died. And so Mark Twain knew both that his daughter had died and that his wife and her sister were coming and had no way to tell them. Knowing not only of the agony he was going through, but all of these things, they're not small. We tend to trivialize them. It is not small to be able to communicate with people you love at all times. It is not small to be able to save someone. Calvin Coolidge's son, 24 years old, went out to play tennis, died of a blister that got infected because they didn't have antibiotics. Public health is not small, and public health is made possible by economic advance. The average person in basically all of the economic growth before the Industrial Revolution from about the time of Jesus, it's about 1% a year. It was not enough to generate all of the things that we have, the universities that 30% of our population graduates from, the public health advances that we have. These things are all, it's all capitalism. That is all the accumulation of capital in firms, which is what capitalism is the accumulation of capital in firms and the distribution of goods via a free market system. Now, does that mean necessarily completely laissez-faire, et cetera? No. And the fact is there never was a completely laissez-faire system, and I often try to, I'm basically libertarian, and I often try to convince libertarians of this. For example, libertarians love to say, monopolies aren't sustainable. So we don't need to do anything about them because they're not sustainable. Well, that's true. Monopolies aren't sustainable because the law won't enforce those contracts. Back when the law did enforce those contracts, monopolies were incredibly sustainable. Cartels are not very sustainable. The incentive to cheat is too high, which is why OPEC can't control the price of oil for very long. They'll get it up for like 5 years and then it always collapses again. Why? Because the incentive to defect is too high. Each producer with no enforcement mechanism has a temptation to cheat. And unless Saudi Arabia, which has the most and cheapest oil, keeps just withdrawing more oil from the market, the price eventually collapses as more and more people cheat in order to get up their own take from the market while keeping other people absorb the price losses from that. But again, there's no enforcement mechanism. If the government enforced cartel contracts, back in the 19th century, cartels were very stable. Because, for example, you could just do a deal with the railroads not to ship products from anyone who didn't join the cartel. That was very effective. So in fact, all capitalism has always been embedded in law. It has always been embedded in custom, and that's what we discovered in 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Right? Is that in fact we thought, oh well, you just get like the legal institutions, you get some banks, and you put it all together. Capitalism, right? The government. We thought of capitalism and government as the inverse. As long as you had the right sort of basic institutional framework, you would have capitalism. Well, it turns out that in fact the operating system of trust. The fact that you guys, undoubtedly, almost all of you, go on the internet and buy stuff from people you have never met, and you just send them money and you're like, I'm sure they'll send me this stuff. That's crazy. That is actually insane that you do that. That is a high trust society that has evolved over centuries, starting with Quaker networks and networks of Jewish people. These networks actually, oddly, often started with religious communities because there was and the Chinese overseas and other ethnic and religious communities because there's a high degree of trust in these little groups. Those people, the Quakers, for example, established one-price selling. They didn't like haggling, they thought it was unchristian, so they said, nope, this is the price, we're not bargaining about it, we'll give you a good price, take it or leave it. All of these things evolved over centuries. All of these institutions, this is the software of society, we don't even think about it. That's capitalism. It's all capitalism, and it is all contingent. There is no perfect vision of the market that we will arrive at and have gotten to when we can stop. There is no perfect version of government or government regulation that we're going to get to and stop. But just to name some of the things that this has given you. Think of John D. Rockefeller, super rich guy, right? You probably have as many clothes as he did. Like you, random college student. Certainly by the time you're a working professional, and you have tons of clothes from Target and your weekend clothes and so forth, you will probably have as many clothes as a super fabulously wealthy person did in 1900. His clothes were super expensive. Back when people had to sew them by hand, or by hand with a machine, back when there was no cutting, back when everything was more expensive. There were no computers to aid the design and pump out vast machines to pump out textiles at the speed that we can now do it. All of those things. Your clothes are much, that's why if you go to old houses, you'll see the closets are tiny. You're probably not there yet, but this is something that in your later adult life you're going to spend a lot of time complaining about, is that your closets are not big enough. That's a crazy thought. You go into these old houses, the closets are like this big for a married couple. Why? The average person had about 5 sets of clothing. That's why they only did laundry once a week. They really didn't need to do it any more than that. And that's a middle-class family. That's not a workman might have. You know, in fact, back in the Middle Ages, people used to sew their clothes on, and that was it. You changed them when they rotted. Transportation. Again, John D. Rockefeller just couldn't get on an airplane. And when he got on a boat, it was incredibly luxurious, etc. He still took him 2 weeks to get somewhere. It wasn't an option. Healthcare. People died of things as late as President Eisenhower. You got a heart attack. The treatment for a heart attack was bed rest and warfarin, which is rat poison. That's all they could do for you, was just say, well, you're going to die eventually. Rest. Let's hope it doesn't happen too quickly. Those are things that just weren't available. Food. King Edward III of England could not have strawberries in winter. That just wasn't a thing. He had strawberries in June, and then there were no more strawberries for the rest of the year. You take this for granted. You go into a supermarket that offers you more food in more quantity than any person on the planet could have had in 1800. Simply not possible to assemble all of that food in one place. And you can buy it for 20 bucks. You can make a complete meal, a really good, expensive meal with top quality ingredients for 20 bucks. Communications, central heating. You know why Victorian people wore so many clothes? It was cold. Or it was too hot. There were no thermostats. You were close to the fire, in which case you were too warm, or you were far from the fire, in which case you were cold. Poor people were just cold. And that was a feature of their lives. All winter. And then all summer they were hot, because there was no such thing as air conditioning. Entertainment. Okay, if you're the king, you can bring in jugglers, and you can have someone stand there. But you can't do that all the time. You can't just stop for 5 minutes and be like, are there some jugglers around? I have a break while I'm waiting to go somewhere. I would like to see something funny. And I'm bored with the jugglers I have. I would like some other king's jugglers. It's just not possible. The amount of entertainment that you have available to you is more than any person had in 1900, even the most wealthy. All of these things, they had servants to do things for them, but it's easier for you to do those things. You think about what it took to clean a rug before a vacuum cleaner, or you think about what it took to cook food before there was commercial food processing to prepare it for you, or a stove that didn't need to be fed with wood, brought up to the correct temperature, wait a while, hope you got it right, stick your hand, this is literally how they used to figure out whether the oven was the right temperature. You stick your hand in and see how long you can take it, before, and then when you pull it out, that tells you what temperature it is, the number of seconds you count. The average woman in 1920 spent 30 hours a week just on food preparation, and indeed if you go to third world countries, that is still what they do. Think about doing laundry. If you read ads from say 1920, 1930 here, there's a description of that Monday evening feeling. What is the Monday evening feeling, you may ask? Well, it turns out people used to wash their clothes on Monday. It is the most incredibly exhausting work. If you have never done it, I don't recommend trying it. Taking an entire family's, all of their clothing, all of their bed linens, etc., first boiling them, then adding lye, then boiling them again, then running them through a scrub board, and then finally, after you are exhausted, hauling all of that soaking wet fabric. We were taking like a quilt, soaked it in water, and then hung it up without having it wrung out to dry on a line. That was every week for every woman in America. And they were exhausted. Not all of that labor is gone, we just don't do it. Only women, and the first thing that all women do everywhere, all around the world, when they get a little bit of money, is they outsource their laundry. They pay someone poor to them to do it, or they buy a washing machine. Capitalism created all of that. So we are richer than kings. Why are we so unhappy about it? And I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't be. So that's not the point of the talk. It's like, oh, well, you know, just be happy you have an iPhone. But why? Why does this make us so unhappy? I want to talk about disruption. Because ultimately, that comes down to that one of the main roots of what we don't like is the disruption, the inequality, the disembeddedness that capitalism inherently produces. Industrialization is about aggregating capital into larger groups. It is about taking us out of small groups and putting us into larger and more efficient groups. It is about making it possible for us to communicate with people far away, which makes it possible for us to leave, or to leave virtually. This makes you in some ways unhappier. You think it makes you happier, because in the moment it does. But it enables you to make what you might think of as a good short-term decision, but a bad long-term decision. Which is that people are actually much happier. One of the things that we know about human psychology is that we really, really like human relationships. We really, really like deep, embedded, connected human relationships that are reciprocal and that have strong ties, not weak ties. That are ties less about acquaintance and friendship and more about mutual obligation that is binding. These are the things, if you look at where people are happy, people who live in small towns are happier. This is something that weirdly in the happiness research, people tend to emphasize certain things that make you happy that tend to go along with urban life. Being religious makes you happier. Much happier, yes. Why are these things true? We like them, but they're hard. Having obligations means that, as anyone who has a big family knows, there's a lot of time you have to spend doing things that you don't like. I don't think entirely unlike, but probably more than our evening's other guest, believe in trade-offs. These things are real trade-offs. You can't have both. You have to pick one. We want the wealth of industrialization. We don't want the disruption and the disembeddedness. There's an old engineering fast food, also applies to fast food joke, good, fast, cheap, pick two. And it's also true of life. Some forms of social organization make us happier in some ways. And not having your kid die is a pretty major way of being happy, and that is something that all Americans get that people didn't used to. You go to an old graveyard, and you look at the big gravestones, and there are usually like a couple little gravestones right next to them. That's something that we just take for granted now, but it's not normal in human history. To just be able to raise all of your children to adulthood. That is huge. And that was delivered by the wealth that capitalism created, which made possible the technological change that has made us fantastically better off in many ways, in many material ways. What do people want out of life? I mean, name some. Predictability. We want to feel like if we do something, we have a good idea of what the outcome is going to be. We don't like gambling. We like the idea that, say, you can go to college and there will be a good job waiting when you get out. We love that idea. We like embeddedness. We like respect. We like to feel that we are valued and respected by other people around us. That's incredibly important. We like to feel useful. We like opportunity. We like choice. We like liberty. We like freedom. We like reciprocity. And again, there are trade-offs between these things. You cannot have all of them. You cannot maximize all of them at once. You can maximize some of them, but it will always come at the expense of others. That is simply the fact of life. Money, when we talk about capitalism, we talk about government capitalism, we tend to talk about it really, really narrowly. We talk about the money. Why do we talk about the money so much? Why? Because we can measure it. It's a number. It's great. It's really easy. We know how much money there is. Well, not exactly. We have a pretty good idea of how much money the economy generates every year. We have a pretty good idea of how much currency, US currency, is in circulation. We have a pretty good idea, if you add up all the bank accounts, et cetera, of roughly how much what you might call ready cash and what a monetary economist would call M2 there is floating around in the economy. And because we know how much the government spends within, I don't know, a few tens of billions of dollars a year anyway, because we can count those things, any political debate, and especially any policy debate, always focuses on what you can count. And I'll give you an example that's in fact not from politics or economics. I have an autoimmune disease that is slowly killing my thyroid. So one of the things I have to do is go and get tested for a blood level that's called your thyroid stimulating hormone. And this hormone, endocrinologists love it because it's a number. Insurance companies love it because it's a number. And so what happened for a long time was they would just start treating the number. So having a bad thyroid causes all these different symptoms. It can make your hair fall out, it makes you fatigued, it makes you gain weight. Not everyone gets all of these symptoms. You can do all sorts of weird things to you. And physicians literally just kind of stopped paying attention to the symptoms and just started trying to hit a number. And so they'd have patients who would say, but I still feel terrible, my hair is falling out, and I'm fat, and I'm constipated, and I'm tired all the time. I mean, like, I know someone who actually injured her, and their physicians would just say, no, your number is fine. you're obviously just eating too much, go to the gym. And I know someone who actually, with a physician like this, injured herself, lived literally on nothing but sashimi and salads, like no carbs, no anything, and was exercising so much at her, to try to get the weight to come off. She went on thyroid. Finally, her physician, she got a new physician, he was like, why don't we try you on thyroid stimulating hormone? Lost 20 pounds in 2 weeks. And now, physicians know this. They started looking only at the number because they could see the number. Because when you can see a number and it's objective, it's so much easier than mucking around and asking someone to tell you how they feel. Because when you ask people to tell you how they feel, right, if you've ever been to the emergency room, I assume a lot of you have, right, and they ask you your pain scale, and they're like, on a scale of 1 to 10, and they give you like, there's a little happy face at one end, and then kind of a frowny face, and then like a really cryy face, right? Well, you know, is my 4 your 4? No one knows. And so they love the number because the number's hard and objective. The fundamental mistake that we make, though, is to think too much about these really narrow issues. I would say like the fundamental mistake that the Marxists made, in fact, more than the free marketers ever did, was that all they thought about was homo economicus. All they thought about was like the machines and the factories and people going off to work and coming home from work and nothing else. And that's a really tiny slice of most people's lives. You spend a lot of time on it, but when you think about the things that people think on their deathbed, when you think about the things that people dream of in advance, most people, work is part of their life. It is not all of their life. All of these other things matter a lot, and capitalism affects them and is affected by them. So when you look at the question that we started by asking, can capitalism be fixed? I would say, you guys are a little young for the reference, but I'll give it anyway. There's an old movie called Soylent Green. Does anyone know this movie? Right. And I'm sorry, spoiler alert. Anyone who doesn't want to see this, just leave the room now. The end of the movie consists of Charles. It's actually a terrible movie. You shouldn't go see it. So I don't feel bad spoiling it. The end of the movie consists of Charlton Heston screaming, "Soylent Green is people!" Capitalism is people. If capitalism's broken, it's because we're broken. It's not that this is some system outside of us that isn't working right, and we can just tweak that system and not touch who we are and what we're doing in our lives in pretty fundamental ways, the ways that go way beyond what your income is, what your income tax is, that have to do with how we live and how we relate to the people around us. So I'm gonna finish by talking a little bit about, I wasn't going to, but I'm gonna, we stand tonight on an election where, everything that we know may be being overthrown. I don't even know, I haven't checked my phone. Are you admiring my embedded discipline? That this insurgency in both parties, by the way, and both saying very similar things, for however much the partisans of both sides would rabidly deny. Like, the actual energy from both the Sanders and the Trump insurgency comes from the same message. Different targets, but the same message. Everything was okay until someone stole it from you. I will grab them by the throat and shake them until I make them give it back. That is really what both of them, the energy that is driving them. Why are we at that moment? And I want to talk specifically to you guys because you guys are part, as am I, by the way. I'm not, this is not, you college, this is not another lecture on millennials, I promise. We are part of why this is happening. Both sides, left and right. Why do I say that? I want to talk about what I've started to call the Mandarin class in America. And I first got this taste of an idea. So my family, I come from a mixed marriage, half working class, half not. It's always the children who suffer most. Now my dad is Irish Catholic, Boston, and educated. My grandmother insisted that all of her children get their PhDs before they were allowed to get married. On the other hand, she did not actually make it all the way. One of my aunts stopped at a master's. A lot of they're all Democrats. They all work in government. All of them have been professors. All of them have all taught somewhere. All of them have worked in government. My mother comes from one of those towns in the Rust Belt that people are always sending reporters off to write about what the hell is wrong with white people now. And so I see both sides of this, right? And I had this extraordinary experience of being on a panel with some pundits who I will not name, and having someone having the moderator say about Social Security and raising the retirement age. Well, of course, we don't know how it looks to working class people. And what was extraordinary was not, and I finally eventually broke in and said, my grandfather worked as a grocery boy until he was 26 and worked his way up to owning a gas station. So in fact, I do, and worked until he died of cancer at 88, every day, out in the freezing cold of Western New York. So I actually have some idea of what that looks like, because I watched my grandfather come in every day, and the thing I always remember my grandfather was that his hands were permanently gray from the oil and the gas. And if any of you have parents or grandparents who are working class, you know this thing of that your hands change, and that we all here have soft hands. And that actually used to be a class marker, is having soft hands. It still is a class marker, but the Mandarin class doesn't even know it, because they're now the second and third generation educated people. They don't. The fact that someone would assume that it went without saying that no one on that stage knew anyone in the working class was astonishing. And it is completely rampant. I had another conversation very shortly thereafter where I was talking about working on a construction site, which I did in a trailer, doing admin work for a couple of years at Ground Zero, actually, after 9/11. I worked there for about a year, and I was just talking about the way construction sites work, and there's usually some guy who's really funny, and he's just constantly kind of taking the piss out of other people. And I always envied these guys, how lightning fast they were at just coming up with one-liners. And another journalist looked at me and said, "You should write a story about that." And I was like, "What's the headline? Working class people speaking complete sentences, make jokes?" Totally, but this is a really common thing. There's a class of about 20% of this country that gets college diplomas and is safe. And you don't necessarily feel safe right now because you're in that terrible time of thinking about what you're going to do the rest of your life, etc. But basically everyone with a college diploma, the unemployment rate is still extremely low. The number of people who are actually in that class, the rest of the country, what's happening now is the war of that 80% against the 20%. Because for the last several decades, on both sides of the political spectrum, the 20% has been dispensing solutions for themselves and telling the 80% that it was for them. And on the right, it's tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. No one in this country, the Republicans have cut taxes so often that no one in this country is paying any taxes except 5 rich people, and they're still trying to run on tax cuts. For who? 90% of the country doesn't care. It's the top quintile that pays a lot of taxes. Everyone else pays payroll taxes, but also now gets higher benefits. Tax cuts are not an issue for them because it doesn't give them anything, but Republicans are still running on it because their donors get something out of it. It's a really key issue for their donors. But look at what the issues are in this election, right? Tax cuts, free trade. But then look at what the Democrats are promising. They're promising free college tuition. Well, 60% of the country never goes or doesn't graduate. Why? What's in it? What's in free college tuition for them? Everyone's going to go to college? Some people don't want to go to college. And this sounds astonishing. People who are college educated. Some people don't want to go, or they find it hard to sit in a classroom, or they don't want that life. But Bernie Sanders is out there promising something for the 20% again, and selling it as for the bottom 80%. This is for the 20%. Childcare. That's great. Working professional mothers love that. So you take something else that appeals to that 20% elite, and it may benefit the people down the scale, but it's primarily about the women's movement, not about that economic class. Universal basic income.
this is something for the creative class. What people want is not the dole. What they want is work. What they want is valuable work where they are respected, where their contribution is valued, and where they're not afraid. And this is one of the big things about inequality now, is that you hear a huge amount about inequality. What you actually see when you look at the numbers, the middle class is indeed shrinking, but it's moving up more than down. So why is that still a problem? Because it increases the feeling, because the people who are up here, now they're afraid because there's farther to fall, because the middle rungs of the ladder are missing. So instead of going down half a step, you feel like you might fall off and end up somewhere really bad. But we never talk about inequality as the distance between the middle and the middle. We talk about inequality as the distance between me and Bill Gates. I don't care how much money Bill Gates has. What I'm really worried about is, can I keep my house? What I'm really worried about is, if I lose my job, am I going to be making an eighth as much? That's not about Bill Gates. That is actually about the hollowing out of the middle. And if you look at work, for example, on income mobility, which I think for a lot of people is a bigger issue, what you actually see is that what matters for income mobility is inequality, but it's not the inequality between the 1% and the 99%. It's the inequality between the top 25% and the bottom 25%. If that gap is large, mobility shuts down. Because again, we had a society that was embedded. We had a society where there were a lot of interrelations between economic classes. We had a society where there were all rungs of the ladder. And now now the Mandarin class is doing pretty well. But first of all, and they actually think that everything's basically fine, what's just needed is to let more people into the Mandarin class. And there are a lot of problems with that. Starting with the fact that, as I think you guys all know, would you rather have a diploma while not having attended any classes, or to have attended classes for 4 years and have no diploma? Right. The reason that you feel that way is that there's a huge credentialing, right? It's a signal. I am someone who is middle class enough and intelligent enough to finish. The value of your college education to you economically is largely about finishing. It is not about your coursework. And because of that, because there's this enormous signaling component to it, what we're doing in a lot of ways is, rather than preparing people for work, we're allocating jobs. We're basically putting people through hoops so that they can prove that they are good enough, skilled enough, conscientious enough, educated enough, and let me say it, middle class enough, because that's who gets through college. In a lot of ways, this is selecting for who your parents were, to do the best paying, most stable jobs. We're not creating more of those jobs. Educating people then just redistributes the number of jobs we have. What we need to talk about is dynamism. The problem is that in a time when people are really afraid, as they really are, genuinely for good reason, there's been phenomenal disruption from all directions. That's a really hard sell. And so the Mandarin class is shutting itself off. It has pulled up the ladder in a lot of ways. And when everyone started getting college degrees, now everyone's getting master's degrees. It's the same people. It's the same kids who are the graduates of the people who actually did gain mobility through education through the GI Bill. But now we're setting the educational credentials higher and higher. And the higher you set them, the harder it is for those people down here who don't have the social capital and don't know how to get up. I realize this is not a popular thing to be saying at a university. But we are changing the system. It is becoming more immobile. And the things that we are claiming are going to enhance mobility are precisely some of the things that are making it harder. A poor kid, it's not that a poor kid can't go get an education, come out, and do well. It's that a poor kid is like Nadia Comaneci. They do everything right and hit a perfect 10. Sorry, is there another gymnast who's not from the 70s? A perfect 10. But they have to do everything right. If they make one mistake, they're out. And we keep increasing the hurdles. We keep increasing this educational credentialing system that makes it harder and harder, even as it's supposed to make it easier and easier. And that is why all of your parents undoubtedly were frantic about getting you into a good college, right? When I was in college, it started junior year for most people. For now in New York, it is literally, in New York City, it is literally true that people are worried about getting their children into a good preschool. I met someone who took his 3-year-old daughter in to interview for a preschool, and they asked her, apparently unironically, what are her aspirations? Well, toilet training at the moment. This system is insane, and it has a lot to do with economic insecurity. The problem is, so why are we talking about these things that are things that the Mandarin class loves, right? Like what Bernie Sanders is promising in terms of universal health care is not that much better than Obamacare, so why is this too big? Right, the difference is not actually that large. Why is it such a big campaign issue? Because it's something that animates the Mandarin class because they're worried about their health insurance. But we don't seem to be able to do a deal on either side where we talk about solutions that are actually for people who are not in that class at all, for stuff that just doesn't benefit us. We're giving ourselves stuff and then promising and then hoping that the scraps trickle down to people below us. And I think that's a huge problem. So that's the, that's the sad, yeah, I'm wrapping it up.
It wasn't for a media, by the way.
So why are we doing this? Why are we coming up with, why is it so much about scapegoats? First of all, because that Mandarin class has things that they don't care that much about, like nationalism. Nationalism matters. You look at Denmark, for example, right? You go to Denmark and you look at like their welfare programs, over like the Danish flag is on everything. Why are they keeping immigrants out? For the same reason. And it has to be that way, right? Like a universal basic income for the United States that involved everyone in the world would be like $2. Even with our massive GDP, we can't. So it is inherently, and people have to understand that, building a bigger welfare state is inherently a nationalistic enterprise. It is inherently about this is our group and we are giving it to them. There seems to be a pretty standard trade-off. Robert Putnam at Yale has done some research on this. There's a trade-off between diversity and how much political support you can have for the welfare state. It's a trade-off between immigration and how much support you can have for the welfare state, and that's what we're seeing in Europe right now. These things are real. There are trade-offs. We have to decide which package we want, because there's no all-inclusive. So what we forgot, I think, over the last 20 years, as this Mandarin class and neoliberal consensus on both sides, is that community matters. It matters a lot. We watched all of these communities breaking down, and you look at what's happened in marriage. You look at what's happened in marriage, college-educated people are great, never better. Catherine Eaton, who's an ethnographer, calls it super marriages. Very high levels of satisfaction, partners of, marriages of equality, et cetera. For people who haven't graduated from college, it's basically completely collapsing. Where now things that we used to think were confined to high poverty neighborhoods are now spreading out to basically everyone. And it isn't just that everyone's having happy, independent, they're not happy about it. It's bad for the kids who have unstable attachments to half of their parentage. These things are economically unstable because a single woman with a child is not an economically viable unit. You get higher rates of, step-parents tend to have higher rates of abuse. I mean, it's everything across the, people aren't happy about their marriages falling apart, but they are anyway. We let that happen. We didn't even notice until it had basically already crossed the line where more than 50% of kids born to mothers who don't have college diplomas are now born outside of a married relationship. And not, as in Sweden, where these are basically like quasi-marriages. Someone who's they're gonna be boyfriend and girlfriend for 20 years, partners. These are unstable relationships that generally do not last 5 years after the child was born. That happened, and we didn't, not even that we didn't do anything about it, because doing something about it, no one knows. We didn't even try, we didn't even talk about it. All of these things are part of this, and there's cultural breakdown, there's capitalism, it's all twined together. It's really hard to tell which is which. Which parts are culture, which parts are capitalism. And that's why you have to kind of look at this stuff comprehensively. And the Mandarin class is not equipped to do that because we don't live near these people, we don't know any of them. We're not interacting with them anymore in the way that people did 50 years ago, when people who were educated were much more embedded in communities of people who weren't. We've hived ourselves off, we've appointed ourselves the technocratic elite who's supposed to be running everything, and then we abdicated because we actually have no idea what's going on out there. And so I'll close by saying, like, again, why are we so focused on this stuff? It's because we know how to do it. Because we know how to measure money, and we know how to hand it out. where like the drunk, the infamous drunk in the joke, who is looking under a lamppost for his keys, not because that's where he dropped his keys, because that's where it's easier to see. We need to think bigger than that. Because if we don't, then people are going to come to the conclusion that capitalism can't be fixed, and nationalism and sort of virulent nationalism is necessary. We're not fixing the problems they have, and so they're looking for something that will. So I'm going to close.
The most disturbing thing I heard in either speech was that going to class apparently does not work with utility. Megan, I appreciate if you would disavow that. As part of my students.
Also, columnists don't change anyone's mind as far as we can tell. So, here's how this will work. I have some questions. We'll give Bhaskar a chance to say something in response if he wants to. But we are going to have questions from the audience because this is an interactive contact board. So there's a microphone in the middle, and I have one question for each speaker. We'll let Bhaskar go first, and then I'll ask some questions. But after that, you should be ready with your questions and lined up with your microphone. So, Bhaskar.
Yeah, sure. Well, I definitely agreed with maybe the first, believe it or not, with the first half of what Megan was saying, because it was actually, an account of the rise of capitalism, which is, fairly accurate. Capitalist abundance is a thing, and it happened. You can actually read about it in Karl Marx. Actually, sometimes Marxists are the best at describing the growth of capitalism, and there's this famous line, all that's solid melts to air. Is that the line? This makes me look bad if I'm not.
It was in German anyway. So.
Yeah, I only read in the original German, so I'm just trying to translate. Oh, and I should mention, since you gave away one movie, The Sixth Sense, I think everyone's dead or something like that. I forgot what the thing was, but I'm going to remember by the end of this. I'm going to tell you all.
In the Wizard of Oz,
I have a big hole in the back.
Okay, I remember that. But obviously, yes, it is true that capitalist abundance was a great triumph. That's why, in a way, the socialist vision isn't just kind of a trans-historical vision. It's not one that says, we're socialists because we're for the underdogs. Even though I'll admit that I'm a Knicks fan for life. I tend to root for hopeless causes and so on. So, but in many ways, it's a vision of taking the abundance that's been created under capitalism, largely on the backs of workers, and taking that and actually trying to imagine building a society that builds on this, not kind of year zero, but something that builds on the abundance and the complexity of society as it is. And yes, in a socialist society, I imagine there'll be lots of alienation. That's one Marxist concept that I think we should leave to just the purely academic realm, because any big complex thing is going to be alienated. I think that you would be less alienated if you were more empowered, if you had a greater sense that you could at least democratically control more aspects of your life, but I think there will always be to some degree alienation. But the best way I could describe it is this way. It's kind of paraphrasing something that Michael Harrington, an American socialist who was a little bit more moderate than me, but a much better writer, so I think everyone should look up Michael Harrington. He had this analogy of the desert, and he talked about the fact that for, millennia and millennia, there's been societies in which, the scarcest resource was water. Marriages were made over water. Clans, fought and killed each other over access to oases and other sources of water. Empires rise and fell all about water. There was even some societies in the American Southwest until not too long ago where this was the case too. Now imagine transporting any of those people and taking them to Brooklyn, New York on a hot summer day when a cop opened up a fire hydrant for kids to play in the water. Like, they would think that this is absolutely insane. This wouldn't make any sense. They wouldn't be able to comprehend what was going on. And I think, in a certain way, we've been so conditioned by the scarcity that's marked humanity since we first emerged up until very recently, that we can't imagine kind of a life without really insidious and unnecessary competition. But I think there is the means material out there to build a different sort of world now. I would also say, though, that a lot of the growth and technological progress that we've had in recent decades, and I wouldn't deny, came out of broad, complex socialization. Not necessarily the fact that it was privately owned, but the fact that it brought together large groups of workers and people. And we all know that capitalism doesn't invest where it's not profitable. That's one of the reasons why, if you look at the roots of things like even the internet, a lot of this is based in public funding and other things, government and state support funding when it's unprofitable. I'm not going to push on this point because I know that Megan would agree that there is room for a state role in some R&D and things like that. She's not like a pure libertarian, so I won't straw man that. But we could also look at, let's say, Scandinavia. Even the way in which, if you have a very strong workers' movement like you had in Sweden, workers make very militant wage demands. And one of the things those militant wage demands do is it causes, sometimes a rate of firm failure. So that the LO, the trade union's like, okay, you can push these demands even if it seems like it's going to take your employer out of business. And the state, okay. And what happens is when these firms are out of business, these workers are then reskilled and turned into more dynamic sectors. But what happens to the firms who are able to withstand this pressure is that often they are more, not to use a capitalist buzzword, but they're more innovative and they're more dynamic, partially because they realize they need to invest in capital-intensive technology if the price of labor is going to be high. So you actually have seen more dynamic, innovative societies and ones where there's actually a strong welfare state. So that's again another kind of false dichotomy. I mean, I would say that the second half of Megan's argument, I was less, I agreed with less. I mean, superficially, I agree that, I probably know many of the same people in this liberal Mandarin class, and I completely agree with a lot of the sentiments. This is where we'll have a left-right, alliance, which, based on history, has always turned out great. But a lot of this reduces class, which I think is a pretty definite structural thing, into kind of a comedy of manners. So in other words, it's not okay to insult a working class person or draw a caricature of them, but it is okay to have them wash your laundry, right? And it is okay to put people in positions of subordination, but it's not okay to, to treat them in a certain way or to have kind of preconceived notions and so on. And if given the two alternatives between a elite liberal who does both, I'll take the version without classism, but that I think turns class into just an identity instead of something that's an identity but also something really structurally rooted. So to the extent, is this a reductionist view? Is this a view that reduces everything to the economy? No, but I think it's a view that talks about the way in which this is a very central and important part of our lives because it's the way we survive and reproduce ourselves. So one of the early, the greatest victory, someone asked me what the greatest victory earlier was of the workers' movement, or the socialist movement. It was easy. It was the 8-hour day and possibly also the weekend. So the motto of the struggle for the 8-hour day, which was actually coined in the U.S., but eventually became the banner of everything across the world, just like May Day, which isn't celebrated here, but actually has origins in the U.S. too, was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for what we will. So part of what we do by focusing a lot on people's material needs and that basis is to actually talk about, because we can't actually sketch out what that 8 hours will be. I might spend my 8 hours very unproductively. I might watch a lot of really bad TV and sports or whatever. There's a story that just came out like last week about a Spanish civil servant that just collected a paycheck for like 5 years and he had no assigned supervisor, so he didn't actually do anything, but he would come in every 2 weeks, just collect the paycheck, whatever. And it's like almost like kind of a hardcore socialist like fantasy of what he did with his spare time. Like he didn't just like squander it on whatever. He actually just survived, skated by, and he became an expert in Spinoza. First of all, like, I do not recommend doing that. I think it's kind of insane.
It's a political theorist.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Don't find something else to do with your time. But I mean, to me, that is an example. I have no idea what people are going to do if they're given more leisure and more free time. I agree that people want to feel like they're contributing something to society, that they're laboring towards something. That's why, like, I said a central piece of what I often talk about is a jobs guarantee and full employment, not the universal basic income thing, which cuts across kind of left, center, and right as this this stream that's often disconnected from for what people are actually asking and fighting for today. But I would fundamentally say that there's one advantage that I have in this debate, and this is an advantage that should be acknowledged. It's very easy, or at least it's easier, to talk about an abstract vision of society and talk about a set of moral and ethical values and compare it to the real messiness of a capitalist society as it exists. But I could point to two things. I could point to the wealth of advances that have been made by left and workers' movements in the United States and elsewhere that have given us doses of humanity within capitalism. And I also point to the fact that a socialist vision doesn't mean completely starting from scratch. It means taking society as it is in its complexity and making sure that the people who at every level of planning and coordination and distribution, average workers and regular managers, who control distribution and the creation of goods, who know how to do their jobs, are given the opportunity to actually take a real ownership role in their jobs. And I think they can do it without a small class of people who mostly just own. They do other things. There's entrepreneurial risk. They contribute at the managerial level and other levels. My point is that labor can replicate what capital does through socialized finance, through other mechanisms, through worker-owned cooperatives, whereas capital cannot, at least for now, until there's crazy robots, so we have a brief window, cannot replicate what workers do. And we want a society in which that division between workers and owners is dissolved. And at once, it's a society that we can envision, because like I said, it's still not perfect. But then on the other hand, this would be a significant change. We've structured society in classes for a long time, and it's only been in the last few decades that it's been possible to do something different. I'm in the party of Carnegie up until like 1914. So don't get me wrong. Like, we can't just list technological advancements and things like that as merely proof that this is a social system that should continue indefinitely into the future.
I mean, I would start by saying, like, look, the Mandarin class existed in the Soviet Union. The Mandarin class, first of all, I think you can actually kind of tell the last 200 decades, the last 200 years of history, not entirely fairly, but also not entirely unfairly, is the revolt of the professional class against everyone else, and the professional class won. And that's always been true, right? I mean, in the Soviet Union, in every socialist society, if you look at, if you go to Scandinavia, I mean, fascinatingly, like, Scandinavia has this incredibly unequal wealth distribution where, like, one family owns something like 25% of all the wealth in Sweden, the Wallenbergs. That number was randomly grabbed out of my dim memory so do not take it, but in fact it's true. Like, in Sweden, one family owns this fantastic amount, and then the guy who started IKEA owns another huge portion. Although this, as I understand it, does not now live in Scandinavia because of the taxes. But first of all, wealth inequality is true everywhere. This is just a thing, and all of these stats that you get of, like, the Waldens own more than the bottom. Well, if you have a zero net worth, you have more than the bottom 25% of Americans right now because you don't have any debt. So if you have actually just zero money in your pocket, as there's a great and horrible story about Donald Trump that Donald Trump's daughter told on television about her father stopping and pointing to a homeless guy and kind of the worst portion of his debt and saying, like, see that guy? He has more, he is richer than I am because he has not $8 billion in debt. The fact that Donald Trump was feeling sorry for himself compared to a New York homeless person, we will leave entirely to the side. But you know, the wealth statistics are weird that way. In a society where debt exists, wealth has always been extremely concentrated. It's slightly less concentrated than it used to be, not stunningly so. If those of you who've read Piketty's book, but I'm somewhat skeptical, let us say, that worker collectives are going to take over for the role of massive agglomerations of capital. There are real coordination problems. And you end up in this problem where, like, libertarians always like to say about gay marriage, we'll just get the state out of marriage. And then you ask things like, okay, well, if they're kids and someone breaks up and they sign a contract and it turns out that contract means that this child's going to live in poverty for the next 20 years because mom signed away the right to have dad support them, what are you going to do? And they're like, well, we'll have this, and then by the time you've walked them through some of the laws, it turns out that what you have is marriage. We've just renamed it like schmo. And somewhat similarly, you know, you can start renaming workers' collectives, and then when you've described who gets rights, and if this guy, and then it turns out that what you actually have is a publicly traded corporation that looks an incredible amount like the existing publicly traded corporation, in which there are some employee ownership plans. But those things, the separations that we've worked out over 200 years turn out to often be quite necessary to get these large agglomerations of capital together, just because holdout problems, incentive problems, all of these boring things that people have to work through, they're really tricky. I would also point out that, you know, there was something you started with, actually, that kind of interested me. Where you said, what? No. Why is it okay to have a working class person do your laundry? What's wrong with doing laundry? This is actually exactly what I'm talking about. The Mandarin class thinks it's demeaning to do laundry. I've worked as a maid in a hotel. It's not demeaning. It's work. Work has dignity. There is nothing wrong with that. I have cousins who work as home health care aides now. It's gross. It's not demeaning. And the fact that we think that, the fact that that slides so easily out of our mouths, is exactly what I'm talking about with this class separation, and we think it's not a class separation, and we want to close it. As long as we think that there is something wrong about doing someone else's laundry, we have the problem. That is a class separation, because it is about demeaning the work that some people do. It is about saying that that is less valuable, less interesting, lower status. We are primates. We care a lot about status. What's fascinating to me, actually, is that, like, how often, you know, when Mayor Barry died a few years ago, and when you look back at, in fact, very similar issues that my own people went through in Boston in the 50s, what's fascinating is that actually how little people talk about the economics of distribution. What you hear much more is respect. There's a great line from Boston Mayor Curley, who actually in many ways was not good for the Boston Irish, but was asked to appoint a Protestant, a Boston Brahmin, to some public commission. And he was basically, I will say, just blatantly running the city for the Irish, and then to a lesser extent the Italians, to buy them off. And someone asked him to appoint this Protestant. He said, I'll tell you what, you can go back before 1880, which is the first Irish mayor of Boston. You can find me the name of one Irishman who held any rank in this city higher than that of patrolman. I will appoint him. They didn't, and he didn't. That's not about the economic opportunity of people right now. That is about respect. And a lot of the fights that then took place in Boston over the years, over everything from school busing to everything else, they were about respect. People care about respect deeply. And the more we disembed the educated class from other people, the more that we come to think that there was really something sad about having to do someone's laundry. Everyone has to do things that aren't fun. Not everyone thinks that work is some sort of personal identity, and that everything is just supposed to be this incredible fulfillment. Many people find satisfaction just in doing work. You don't have to enjoy the work all the time. I'm not saying they're like happy doing it. No one does, frankly. No one enjoys all of their lives. No one enjoys all of the activities of every hour of every day, is what I mean. And there's some work that I hope will be automated because it's terrible. Factory work, in fact, the beloved manufacturing jobs, if you've ever actually been on an assembly line, they're the worst jobs. They're worse than doing laundry. There's almost nothing that I would not do before I worked at an assembly line. It's the most boring job you can imagine. They're well paid. They're terribly boring, but they have dignity. And that matters. And so, like, I'll close there, and then we can, but the last thing I should say is that we in fact know what most people do when they're not working. They watch television. And in welfare states, when you look at unemployed people, they watch television. When you look at unemployed people here, they watch television. And that's what goes up. And we would like to think that everyone's going to be like writing sonnets, etc. And I'm not demeaning that, right? Like, it's not like I've produced a lot of sonnets recently. But in fact, there's this idea of we'll have universal basic income and people will be able to quit and write sonnets. And like, again, there is a really small portion of people who want to do that and have the self-discipline to sit down and do this. And I was asked a funny question, because I grew up in Manhattan, where there's a lot of trust fund kids, where someone said, why aren't you against trust funds? And I was like, oh, but I am. In fact, this is true at all levels of the income spectrum, is that not being embedded, not being forced to embed yourself and be in a reciprocal work relationship with other people, that doesn't mean it has to be demeaning, that doesn't mean that the conditions have to be terrible. But it allows people to make a short-term decision that they don't regret then, but then the trust fund kids often just kind of never end up doing anything, and then at 50 or 60, they regret it. And so I think we have to think seriously about all those issues, and think about how we provide meaningful work for people that isn't like everyone has to be a cartoonist or whatever, but that is something that has respect and dignity, that isn't impossible, it isn't wildly insecure, isn't impossible for them to do physically as they get older, and it allows them to feel like they are valued, because we are not valuing a whole lot of people in our society right now.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to start to take questions from the audience. I'm going to ask one question for each of our speakers, but if you have a question, you should feel free to start lining up at the microphone. I'm going to ask Bhaskar a question first. Bhaskar, I was really moved by the beginning of your talk about all the negative things about capitalism, over the critique part. There's a lot of things that sounded plausible there. I almost sounded, I was so moved, I almost thought I was listening to a Bill Clinton speech. Sorry. That's supposed to be it.
Yeah, I know, it makes me uncomfortable, but
I hear a lot of what you say about the negative side, but what is coming on your account, I'm still a little bit fuzzy about. And so I guess I just want to ask, where does the collective ownership of the means of production fit in your scheme? Why do you think that would be a good thing? I mean, do we know enough to actually? Does government know enough to actually manage all these things? Isn't that sort of the way that it would kind of have to work out if it's actually public and it's owned collectively, if that means anything? And what barriers do we have against abuse, right? This is the whole problem with government, is how do you get it to stop doing bad things?
Okay, right. So I mean, sorry, I was knocked over. 1 second. Yeah, I think there's a confusion of a few terms, so maybe it's worth clarifying that first. So for one thing, my conception of class. So there's a reason why I didn't talk about wealth inequality, for example, and follow that particular discourse, even though wealth inequality is a symptom of things. Because in my view, the issue of class is more relational than gradational. So in other words, you could be, a self-employed person who, or maybe like run a small, a business, and employ a bunch of people and still take home $45,000, $50,000 a year. You could work as a longshoreman and earn $120,000 a year. And in my conception, you'd be a worker if you're a longshoreman. You wouldn't be a worker if you weren't. And that has political implications if you're talking about, how do you organize people. So the reason why, for example, manufacturing jobs are well paid isn't a historic accident. They used to not be well paid at all. It was because of victories of the workers' movement and unionization and so on. And also the reason why, for example, we live in a society where, I imagine in a socialist society, there'd be certain work that people wouldn't really want to do, and that would probably have to be very remunerated work. So, for example, if we've found it harder for someone to do, less people want to do sanitation work at current wages if there was a really strong welfare state and they were no longer compelled into that kind of work, if they didn't want to do it, then chances are that would have to be very well paid work. And if you think public health is important, then maybe we should be paying some of those workers, close to what we're paying, physicians. So I think in the same way there is a conflation here between government ownership of things and social ownership of things. So my vision of socialism isn't the DMV, but instead of being frustrated trying to get your license, you're frustrated trying to get food. That is not my vision of socialism. So no bread lines. There will be bread though.
Not low carb socialism.
Right. Not low. I'm waiting on the science to disprove that, so I don't have to. So in other words, I actually think it's quite easy to imagine because we see certain spheres of life decommodified, taken out of the market, and you can imagine more spheres of life that are absolute social necessities taken out of the market, like housing. At least have that strong safety net that doesn't exist today. Then you can imagine you would still have markets for other things. At least in my vision, there wouldn't be complete planning. So I do think there's successful examples of very big worker cooperatives. One of the largest corporations in Spain until recently, I think it was up to 8 or 9. It was Mondragon, which is a worker-owned firm. That firm has all sorts of problems, and it also does have a division of labor. So this is another thing to conflate. Like, there's a difference between class and a division of labor. It's a difference between us in this room sitting together and saying, all right, we need to elect 6 managers, and we need to elect them to a 2-year term, and we need to give them different pay differentials, and still have some hierarchy in the workplace, and saying that at the ownership level, we should not have a democratic say or a share in our economy. And also, this isn't a matter of just writing a blueprint, right? So I can't sit and say socialism is a democratic system where more people are democratically empowered, and here's exactly how your democratic system is going to look like. I was joking earlier that I would imagine in a socialist society, my vision would be a center-right one, where I would be like, okay, maybe we need some pay incentives, maybe we need some stratification of these levels. It needs to be democratically accountable. If you have a 13 or 14-year-old, you might, I would imagine none of you college students would, I don't know, I'm using this example.
They start younger every
right.
year.
You might be able to tell that person what to do. And in that case, that authority is justified socially, it's justified morally and ethically. But there's certain restraints on that relationship. You can't abuse children without getting in trouble, and so on and so on. So I think that it's not that complicated, but part of it is just here's a starting point, here's a set of moral and ethical precepts to try to build towards build a society around. And we can see bits and pieces in it. We see a lot in the the success of the Scandinavian welfare state. We see bits of that decommodification. We see in cooperatives and other things bits of what democratic ownership of the economy would look like, but this isn't kind of a 0 to 100, like, now you're in socialism, you're not getting out kind of thing.
I hope you won't feel left out if I don't ask you a question. We have lots of people here who I'm sure have lots of questions, so let's go straight to the audience.
Okay. Hi, my name is Claire McManus. I'm a grad student here in development management, and I wanted to say, just for a second, narratives matter. So I do have an unemployed immigrant husband, and he does watch television, but he also volunteers for a Tanzanian nonprofit, is teaching himself French and is planning an economics career.
I was long-term unemployed for 2 years, so this is not like unemployed people are lazy, terrible people.
Well, they do more than just watch television.
They do, but like we actually have pretty good time data studies of what the average person does, and like what increases when people are unemployed as their television watching or sleep.
Yes, no, I'm sorry. I wanted to put out the narrative. Also, I did my own laundry in the Peace Corps and lived on $300 a month. So, yeah, I think respect and dignity are the core issues. And my question to you, you reference history. and how the King of England, we're better off than him, but the Queen of England today owns palaces and her family controls a vast fortune. In Saudi Arabia, there are ATMs with gold bars and private islands, man-made islands, and an indoor ski slope. So my problem with capitalism today is it has nothing to say about that. It has nothing to say about the Martin Shkreli's of the world. It doesn't have any moral force. And in the capitalist system right now, it isn't dealing with respect and dignity. And you think, from what it sounds like, you said, well, that's it. You just have to deal with it. And is that your thinking?
Well, I would first of all really challenge the idea that it's disrespectful to have more money than someone. I think that again invests too much respect in money.
It's not disrespectful, it's unjust when billions of people live on less than $1 a day.
But how many people would you help by taking down the indoor ski slope?
Millions.
Millions with an indoor ski slope?
And the private islands and the golden jets and
Sure, but who makes the jets? What do they do? What do the people who work on the private islands do then?
well,
Right, it's actually
the people in Qatar building the soccer stadiums, they die. There's about 4,000 projected to die.
I am not justifying work conditions in Qatar for the immigrant. Right. I mean, so first of all, calling Saudi Arabia capitalism is weird. They're basically, they basically, very few Saudis work.
Isn't that a product of
it's kind of a welfare state for Saudis, right?
Isn't that a product of the global capitalist system though?
Well, oil has to be distributed somehow. How, and the Saudis have it. Are you going to take it away from them? Are you going to invade Saudi Arabia?
Isn't there a better way though? That's the thing, capitalism is not
That's
offering.
not capitalism. That's actually national borders. And I would argue that for us to sit around and decide that Saudi Arabia should have to give up its oil, like people have very pungent words when the United States starts deciding what people in the Middle East should be able to do about their national borders and that they should give up their oil. That societies have a certain right to decide internally what they're going to do. I'm not, I've never been to Saudi Arabia. I have my obvious objections as a professional woman to some of their laws. But I also think there's a kind of incredible privilege of me, American, sitting around and deciding that I know what's best for Saudi Arabia and I'm going to go in. You're kind of conflating actually two completely separate issues.
My broader point was the global 1%. Capitalism has nothing to say about the morality of that much wealth being concentrated in that few people.
Well, but look at who the global 1% are outside of Saudi Arabia, because I think we're not going to invade Saudi Arabia and take their oil. So we don't, we kind of have to confine this to systems that we might reasonably affect, which is more like the United States. Or other, London, whatever, but we're probably not going to take their oil, and we're probably not going to redo the economic structure of people in the Middle East who happen to be sitting on a lot of oil with a very low number of people. So what do we do about, Bill Gates is in fact giving away most of his money, and got most of his money by making something people wanted. Now we can get into a discussion about whether Windows is terrible, but people wanted it. They gave him their money voluntarily. And that's in fact the heart of capitalism. It's voluntary exchange of something I have for something I want more. And that's actually the system that powers all the stuff you now want to give away. You can't just destroy the system and then hope you'll still have the stuff to give away. And that was really the lesson of the communist dictatorships. They invested way too much in the idea that the machines were the important thing, and way too little in the idea that the software, this massive, voluntary, messy, uncontrolled, occasionally unjust, maybe more than occasionally unjust, that whole system is what created the state of poor countries. That's natural. That's what everyone looked like. Right? We talk about poverty as if it's some sort of weird divergence from the rich countries. Actually, the poverty is natural. The poverty, everything looked like that in 1500. We are weird. And so before we start talking, I'm in favor of foreign aid, et cetera. I'm in favor of development to the extent that we know what to do. And but before we start talking about tearing it down, we might want to add, we have to be real careful that we're not tearing down the part that made the stuff that we have to give away.
So in the interest of equity, I think we have a lot of questions. Let's get to it.
Sorry.
Okay.
Should we take a stack of 3 questions maybe and then do responses?
It's hard to remember. I find 3.
I'll
try.
I'll try and be
Try to go fast.
First off, Megan, I want to thank you for the comparison of capitalism to Soylent Green. I'm going to use that in the future. My question is you made the point that that we should value, say, someone who is doing laundry, and I completely agree with that. My question is, though, is the issue, say, an individual in the Mandarin class isn't valuing laundry, or is it capitalism as a whole that is paying somebody minimum wage to do laundry, not valuing them? Whereas, say, an alumnus, is Neil Kerwin still president of AU?
Yes, he is.
So Neil Kerwin is getting paid, what, $300,000? So his
$1 million.
Whoa! It's gone up a lot since I've been here. Okay. So the market.
No, you naive child.
So clearly the market is valuing his work more than the woman who's doing laundry. So is that a problem of individual personality, or is that a problem of the market not assessing value correctly?
So let me actually break that into 2 separate questions, because I actually think there are 2, when you compare those 2 particular sets of people, there are kind of actually 2 questions there. And the first is that what is our fundamental discomfort with the market? In a lot of ways, not in all ways. But one of the fundamental discomforts is that some people's labor isn't worth enough to keep what we think is a decent basic level for Americans. And that's a real question. What do you do? One answer is to just mandate that the market pay them a wage that you feel more commensurate with their value as a human being. I don't like that answer, because I think what you see then is unemployment. You especially see unemployment among young people. There's this kind of weird folk myth going around that a study by Alan Kruger and David Card has disproven the disemployment effects of minimum wage. This is a really incredibly weird and naive read of what the research tells you. Another answer, which I think is a better answer, and I think the answer that we've more and more converged on, is that instead of trying to drive up the wage and risking that some employers just can't afford that wage, that you say, okay, socially, we're going to use the earned income tax credit to make their work pay more on the back end. That instead of saying it's the owner of a Wendy's, it's his problem to make sure you make enough money, and if you don't, then it's too bad that you're unemployed. To say it's all of our problems, we've decided this is the basic level for an American, and we're going to make sure you make enough money. If you put in, I think that the kind of basic insight that I absolutely firmly believe is, look, if you are willing to work 40 hours a week in the United States, you should be able to earn enough money to support yourself at the age that you are. I don't think an 18-year-old needs to be able to support themselves, living alone in a 2-bedroom apartment or any of these other weird metrics. You're 18. You can have a roommate. We all did. On the other hand, it should be possible as you get older to get the experience and get the wages that you need to support yourself. And if you can't, then we should help you, because you're an American, and that's part of. And this goes back to, I think, what I said before. There's a nationalist component to this. There has to be. We have national borders. We're doing these programs within national borders. So I like programs that are social, that are transparent, that are basically pretty efficient, and that don't involve setting price floors on wages, precisely because I think it's disruptive. And I want people to have as many choices about work as they can. And if you cut off some of those choices by making it, but the problem is that people have this intuition that, oh, we're subsidizing employers now, right? You hear this over and over with Walmart. It's not fair that we have to subsidize them. Well, I don't understand why it's more Walmart's problem that someone's labor isn't worth enough than it is all of ours. They're our fellow citizens. We should all be willing to help.
Next question.
Hi, my name's Kevin. I'm a law student here, and I would say that it's because the Waltons have so much frickin' money, that they should probably, it's their responsibility to pay for those people. But that's just a side comment. Bhaskar, thank you for being here. And for all of you guys, if you guys haven't read Jacobin, it's awesome. It's a great resource. It's a fantastic way to get different ideas that you wouldn't get in a normal media source that you read. So I just want to give you a shameless plug. That being said, Megan, your theoretical framework to me fundamentally doesn't make sense because it has no consistency. Because you first of all went into the whole issue of we're richer than, that's just an apples and oranges comparison because of time. And if you look back at, say, when you said 1,500 years ago, well, the view from the castle window was quite a bit better than the view from the field. So even then there you have massive amounts of inequality based, okay. Yeah. So it's not like everyone was poor. There was a significant difference.
Well, but by our standards, right? They were itchy,
that's
poor.
That's apples and oranges. I mean, you judge it by the standards of the time, and given the inequality of the time.
My point is that the difference between then and now is capitalism.
Well, yeah, sure, but that doesn't justify capitalism, right? That only explains why we have more stuff, right? It doesn't justify the system. So,
well, unless you want to go back and live in that time, I feel that it does in fact justify capitalism.
No, the issue is, what was your definition of capitalism again? I'm curious.
It is the aggregation of capital into large institutions and the distribution of goods and services via free exchange.
Okay, and how is that done? What are the costs of that, and what does that produce?
I think those are all interesting questions, but I certainly couldn't. I mean, that's it. It's
well,
like a library, not a panel answer.
Okay, so get the TLDR version then, if you have to. I mean, it produces massive inequality. It's gotten through by exploitation of labor, and it increases that division such that it creates crisis.
Well, but okay, every country, capitalist or not, has had inequality, massive inequality. I mean, like
where are the non-capitalist countries? Just out of curiosity.
Well, in history now.
Well, even in the 20th century. I mean, if you could call the Soviet Union, yeah, you could call that, but I mean, it functions exactly. The class relations that Bhaskar were talking about are essentially the same.
Yeah, that might not be an argument against capitalism. That might be an argument that communism wasn't a good solution for this problem.
Or that it's a different form of capitalism.
Right? Yes, inequality is a feature. If we give everyone in this room the same amount of money, we would not all be the same. There would still be actually massive inequality in all sorts of things. Inequality is a feature of life. There are people who are prettier than others. We're not going to redistribute it. There are people who are happier than others. There are people who are sadder than others. There are people who are more able than others. I mean, those are just things that exist.
No, but you get those because that's the way you're born. You get wealth because you steal it from other people. You steal it through the exploitation of their labor.
So maybe why don't you respond once, and then we can get to the other question.
Sure. I think that's the worst part of this whole system, right? Is that you get the wealth because you take it from the people who produce the value.
If I pay someone to say do my laundry, who's stealing from whom?
Well, how much do you make off of that person? So how much do you sell it for?
How much do I make by
how much profit are you making? That's the
by getting someone to
justification.
do my laundry?
Well, okay. Well, that's a great way to get
the next question. So we got the point.
All right.
Hi, my name is Jeremy. I'm an undergrad studying history and SAS. I have one question for each of you. Bhaskar, I think say Bhaskar, sorry. I can't remember you guys know names. When it comes
Megan,
to
you should get.
Yeah, Megan. When it comes to paying for social welfare programs, where does the money come from? Because I know with universal basic income, that's a huge issue of like, who do we tax and what do we tax and where does the money come from? So how would you answer that, I guess? And for Megan, having cooperative owned industry, wouldn't that increase, what's it called? Not diversity, competition. Competition within different fields by having more companies and producing the same product and thus increasing, I guess, the capitalist system. So I guess that's for the question.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just really quickly, I would actually say that I agreed with the surprising amount of what Megan was saying, because some of it is just the fact that the only thing worse, this is like a Jameson quote, I think, the only thing worse than being exploited by capitalism is not being exploited, by capitalism. And I think that's an insight that, a lot of Marxists would agree with. I think all Marxists should agree with. But I would say that this question of taxation, fundamentally, I think a lot of the value in society, not all, I think it's stupid to say all value in society, most of it comes from workers. So let's say if I'm employing you for $50 an hour stably for 10 years, crudely from just that information alone, we could probably deduce that he's earning more than $15 an hour for me, right? And that difference between what I'm getting back in return for his labor, what he's earning, is, to me, exploitation. And that doesn't mean it all has to go back to him, but in my kind of just democratic society, he would have more democratic say on what happens to that surplus, where it's distributed, where it's going, and so on. I think in a welfare state, a welfare state within capitalism is reliant on having profitable capitalist firms that can be taxed. I mean, wealth comes from other sources and so on, but under capitalism, it requires taxing firms and the income of individuals and the assets of firms. But the justification for that is simply someone like Bill Gates, in fact, didn't just write the whole operating system himself. There was a lot of workers who wrote it with him. There's a very complex chain. A lot of those people didn't get back everything they put into that effort. By taxing Bill Gates after the fact, we're making sure that some of this comes back to them in the form of universal programs and so on that enables them to, have a better life.
I think there's kind of two justifications for taxation, and one is or law. One is if you think people got their money by unjust means, the problem is not that they're rich. The problem is the unjust means, and that's actually what you need a law to address, right? Then there's an argument for taxation, which is just it's easier for a rich person to give more than a poor person, so they should, and I think that's a totally fair argument, which is why I support progressive taxation. But with companies, there's something called the minimum efficient scale, and then economies of scale, and what you get is that it may be that there's only one efficient Facebook, right? It might not actually be better if we had 5. It's great that we have Twitter and all these other things, but there are things where actually you only want one company. And similarly, are we going to get more competition with a different capital form? I tend to think that markets converge to a level of competition that doesn't have much to do with how the firms are financed, but has to do with, first of all, how is the government regulating to make it either harder or easier to invest in that market? And then second of all, what in the market, what's the kind of minimum efficient firm size? So like an auto manufacturer, airframes, airline, it's actually something where there might actually, the right actual economically efficient scale of airframe manufacturers might be 1. We have 2 in the world, but it might be 1 because it's so big and expensive to invest in. Whereas on the other hand, bodegas, very, very low in a minimum efficient scale. And so those markets are going to be defined by the efficiency of the production and what's needed to do it, less than changing the ownership form.